All right, you guys ready to party? Okay, sweet. 3, 2, 1. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Exercise Mechanic Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking all about how to structure a diet plan for various needs and goals of your clients. I'm once again joined by the Exercise Mechanic team, Brett and Ryan. Gentlemen, how are we doing?
Very good.
Yeah, good, man. Thank you.
I did all of that on one breath of air, and I realized halfway through that I might have to restart this recording if I run out of oxygen halfway through. But I'm glad that didn't happen. In any case, prior to recording, we were talking about how to structure this conversation, and evidently there are aspects that we initially discussed that we have in common. And then also some unique considerations were tabled by each of us. So I think today's conversation is going to be really interesting. When this topic was initially tabled, this topic of how to structure a diet plan, where did your minds go initially? Like, what was the first thing that popped into mind when it came to like, okay, how to structure a diet plan? What's the first thing you have to consider?
So I think the first thing, and we both had said this again before we started recording, the first thing that popped in my head was a needs analysis, which I've probably said ad nauseum at this point on the podcast. But I do think that the quality of solutions that you have for a client, whether it be nutritional or otherwise, stems from the quality of the questions that you ask them. So the more digging that you do, and even if, their answers aren't particularly specific or they aren't particularly unique, it just allows you to create a strategy for that particular client that actually solves, or at least is closer to solving the problems that they may have. So I think that learning how to ask the right questions is kind of the starting point.
Yeah. Brett, how about you?
Those questions include like a food journal for you, Ryan, or is that something that might come later on after kind of an initial analysis?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that comes potentially afterwards. So even the implementation of different strategies to gather more information is dependent on kind of that initial conversation. So for example, some of my clients who many of them are trainers and coaches themselves. So they have experience coaching their own clients through nutrition. They've got some really solid habits in place. So they might not necessarily be somebody who requires like a food journal initially. If you've had somebody who, maybe isn't an experienced trainee and they've never had any kind of structured eating, a food journal might be really useful in the same way that, you would like audit your finances to figure out, where there's areas that you could cut expenses, areas you couldn't, whatever it happens to be. So that would depend on some of those initial questions that you ask them. But I do think that a food journal can be very helpful, especially for what I would consider like a quote unquote lifestyle client. If you're somebody who is already deeply involved in the fitness space, you've probably had intentional eating at some point. So you've already been mindful of the food that you're eating, timing, maybe even weighing things out. But if you're somebody who has never done that before, like I think there's a lot of people outside of the fitness space who, you don't always realize. Actually, funny enough, I went through this a couple of years ago when my parents first downloaded my MyFitnessPal. And I had taken for granted certain things about how people would eat, and especially because my parents are athletes. And I remember them being shocked at like how many calories were like in a bag of mini eggs, or like my stepfather was eating like 60 grams of protein a day and he's like 180 pounds. Like it was almost alarming how little they knew about their nutrition at that time. And then watching them, as I said, like kind of audit their food. And then they were able to start to make some changes from there. But I think for people who have never had intentional eating before, to your point, Brett, I think a food journal of some sort can be really, really effective.
Yeah. Not only as like how would I say, as a means of establishing perhaps like what's their starting point. Like they've been, maybe tracking what would be an average day of eating so as to get an idea of like in practice for them, what are their maintenance calories? Like if they've been stagnant in terms of weight for a year, and what does an average day of eating look like, But I agree with you. There's when I was in Geneva, there was a handful of people that I worked with who were like athletic folks and you ask them to log their food for a few days and they're like, fucking hell, I had no idea that this is what I was eating or this was in my food. And if we think about empowering clients beyond our time together, find that inevitably it needs to move in the direction of teaching and helping people understand the take a drink, the nuanced reality and the components of, Brett, you actually gonna take a drink? Nice. Just like what is the reality of what they're eating, so that way they can then be equipped to make decisions. And so I think that's really good. It's definitely happened for me in the past where when I was working with clients, if I didn't do a good enough job with that initial needs analysis, where then the like intervention or the strategy that you implement is just not appropriate. And it was sometimes because I made some presuppositions of, oh, this is what they mean, or I think this is what they want. But just getting really, 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 really clear of like, what are their goals? What are their associated timelines? And then also one of the things that I wrote down here as a note that I wanted to table is during that needs analysis, talking to them about like, what are some of your other priorities that may actually enter into conflict with this objective? And when it kind of inevitably does, which one are you going to choose? Like I'm sure we've all had clients in the past who have a body composition goal. And as much as they have that goal, they actually value connecting with their family at social gatherings, more than their goals. Like if you actually tease that out, a lot of folks, that's actually the case. And sometimes there's a little bit of hard truth that needs to be shared where it's like, you say you want this, but you also want this. Sometimes those things enter into conflict depending on the frequency and the intensity at which they happen. And so sometimes you need to manage your expectations. And I find that that kind of conversation also happens or can present itself during a needs analysis. Have you guys experienced that as well?
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also find too, people can come in and especially if they're not expecting the questions about diet, it might not be intentional, but you ask them what you eat in an average day or walk me through like an average breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and they'll tell you about it, but maybe they'll forget or just happen to neglect the like bag of chips in the afternoon or like and it again, might not be malicious. A lot of people are kind of unconsciously eating. It's just like, oh, I feel that hunger pang, I'm just going to grab what's in the cupboard. And so I think a food journal can help people get a little bit more connected with what they're eating, and come with you with a bit more accurate information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, and something you said, ET, I used maybe slightly different wording, but essentially the same idea. I always think of, as you said, to use good life terminology, like the needs, goals, time frame, and then identifying what are potential obstacles there. So as you said, do they have different priorities? Are there going to be points in time where, they play on a summer softball team and they go out for drinks every Saturday after they have a game? Like that might conflict with their weight loss goal. Mm-hmm. Is there anything to be done where like maybe they, instead of having beer, they have some, you know what I mean? Like it could be some kind of strategy, but it's like, how can we like find a workable solution to this obstacle? And I think a really important thing is understanding that things don't have to be perfect. They just need to be good enough.
Yeah, it's huge.
And if you can make enough things good enough for long enough, I think that's where people will have success. And I think really, really learning how to, as you said, ET, like educate your clients on when they do hit these roadblocks or these obstacles, or they have time restrictions, being able to have, maybe more than one solution. So, for example, I've got a client who is in and out of travel for, the next couple of months. And then that could be for him, he tends to resort to a lot of like restaurant eating, ordering out, that kind of thing. So even coming up with like, all right, does the Airbnb that you stay at, does it have a rice cooker? Can you buy one, or like something along those lines? Could you buy like a cheap $20 rice cooker at the Airbnb you're staying at? Are there options is there a food delivery service that's nearby? So maybe you don't have to cook it, but you can get macro-friendly meals that aren't McDonald's and Harvey's and that kind of thing. So just like learning how to strategize and navigate some of these issues that are inevitable. Even the most dedicated fitness person, they're still, I feel like I say this a lot, like they're still a human being. They're not just this calorie consuming robot. So there's emotions and what preference and all of that you have to deal with. So I think the biggest thing is just figuring out how with your client you can create scenarios where things are just good enough.
Brett, anything you want to add on there?
Yeah, I wrote down in my notes harm reduction, which is to your point,
great.
good enough. And it's something I've used a lot with clients. I remember meeting with one person for the first time. And as we were going through his diet, he mentioned that he would eat like a sleeve of Oreos just about every day. They were just always in the cupboard. And like, this guy's been doing it for probably a decade or more. I'm not going to stop him from eating Oreos. If I tell him stop buying Oreos, he might last 2 days and then he's going to go to the store and probably buy twice as many packs. So our strategy that we used was to replace it with like a dad's ginger cookie or something like that, like something that's a lot less sugar.
Those are unreal. They're so tasty.
Has maybe a little bit of fiber in it, but it still scratches that itch. He still gets his crunchy cookie, switching from Pepsi to Diet Pepsi. There might be some arguments about the health of diet sodas, but I think that we can probably all agree that they're more healthy than a full-blown sugar soda. And stuff like that is huge. Substitutions is something I've used quite a bit with clients as well.
Totally.
Just try to scratch that same itch, find something. I've dealt with a few clients with, maybe we won't call it full-blown alcoholism, but definitely some issues with alcohol, and trying to find like some kind of beverage. I used to brew kombucha, so my first is usually get some booch. It has that kind of like fizz and that funk. If you're into alcohol, usually less than 1% alcohol content in it, or like fizzy drinks, something to replace that is going to be way, way more long lasting than just trying to eliminate entirely.
No, I'm curious because this is something that I've done not only with clients from a training perspective, but I've also applied it nutritionally, and I'm curious if you guys do as well. Just this idea of pre-framing and like preparing people for like the inevitable and predictable discomforts associated with an outcome. Because I found that, like for instance, if we use running as an example, like it is very predictable. Even if you're really fit, you're going to hit these like little mini like fake walls at like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes. You're nowhere near done. You're nowhere near your capacity, but like you're going to like, you might have thoughts telling you to stop or that you can't do things. And if you just persist through it, you realize that you're okay. And I found that when it comes to nutritional interventions, especially nutritional interventions meant to drive fat loss specifically, there's a real discomfort that comes with being in a sustained calorie deficit. Ryan, you know this probably far better than Brett and I do. And that discomfort isn't actually a bad thing. It's proof and it's evidence of like you're actually doing the right thing. And so having the ability to be ready for this thing that inevitably happens, and then when it does, you can be like, I knew you were coming. And instead of that knocking us off track, it can actually just confirm that we're doing the right thing, normalize some of the discomfort, and hopefully help potentiate adherence. Do you guys do something similar with your clients?
Yeah, I have two thoughts on this. The first, I think I saw this on a YouTube video maybe 2 years ago or so, from Joe Bennett, the hypertrophy coach. Now, he was talking about training, but I think the principle applies. And he was teaching a group of students, and he had asked them, like, what's the number one role of a trainer or a coach? And many people said, accountability, which I think is a great answer. I actually preferred his answer, which was managing expectations. And I think the accountability, and there's a variety of other things that go along with that, but learning how to manage expectations with a client, I think is huge, because it also gives them a realistic understanding of what's to come and the steps necessary to get there, sacrifices that they're willing to make, etc. The other thing that I was thinking as well, I think that learning how to speak the language of your client matters. And I don't just mean in the sense, people usually use that phrase in terms of, don't use complicated anatomy and physiology terms with your client because it doesn't matter that much to them, but also means to that specific client, what types of phrases, what types of reasoning resonates with them. So, for example, again, because I work with mainly people who are doing some kind of physique training, whether it be actual competitive bodybuilding or just, trying to look good. I could think of two scenarios. One, where, as you said, inevitably you're going to hit a point if you are dieting for a prolonged period of time where things just feel hard, you're tired, maybe your brain doesn't work quite as quickly as you're used to. And for one client who I know is very interested in, self-improvement, he reads a lot of philosophy, that type of stuff. And it's not a disingenuous statement, but understanding that that's something that's important to him. So we actually had a conversation this prep where, he had some concerns because he was noticing just the inevitable fatigue and stress. And we had this conversation where it was like, hey, people grow in periods of time of discomfort. So rather than shying away from this, lean into it, understand that while this thing is really difficult, you are becoming this version of yourself that you want to be. And for him, that's oh, cool. Yeah, that's a thing that just really clicks in my head. And then there's other situations where, somebody who's hyper competitive that has a little bit of I don't want to say elitist, that's a little bit too rude, but is driven by this competitive feeling of just beating other people. So that might be the exact same scenario. And the phrasing that I might use is look, other people would quit here. Are you other people or are you better than other people? And they go, yeah, I'm better than other people.
That's so funny.
The outcome is ideally still the same, but it's just learning the language that client speaks in order to continue to nudge them in the right direction.
I love that. There's a trend in the fitness industry to and we've talked about it before, to completely throw out motivation. And it's you only need discipline. Motivation is fleeting and unnecessary. And I like that you're able to leverage motivation to get some results and kind of push past those little blocks. It's cool.
One of the things that we've talked about specifically in the hypertrophy intensive, because here we've talked a lot about perhaps this idea of some of the initial steps and kind of setting the stage for the journey. But then I think one of the next questions is, well, okay, where do you go from here? And I think that to be able to give some kind of concrete advice to our listeners, I think maybe what we could do is we could talk about some examples. So first and foremost, we need to start with the goal. So let's say someone has the objective of fat loss as an objective. Where might we start? In the hypertrophy intensive, Ryan, you brought forth this idea of predictive versus reactive modeling. And I was hoping that maybe you could share with our listeners what that is as a means of kind of categorizing the initial strategy and then the subsequent strategies. And you also had some recommendations with regards to rate of loss, which I don't know if you have it memorized, but I wrote it down in case you didn't. So don't worry, I got your back. But I was curious, maybe you could kind of run us through, run us and the listeners, through what is that? What are some of the considerations for fat loss when it comes to predictive and reactive modeling, and maybe just define them as well?
Sure. And my disclaimer to this is always every situation is N of one. So some of these recommendations may fit a particular case and they may not fit others, but it's intended to apply to the general case. In terms of the predictive and reactive modeling, full disclosure, I completely made those terms up because I wanted a way of differentiating two strategies that eventually come together. And essentially all it is if we think of predictive modeling, it's using some kind of technology to estimate a rough starting point in terms of caloric consumption for a client. So you essentially are just using, there's the BMI calculators, there's a variety of different apps or websites and stuff that you can do this with. In the course, we give certain recommendations as well that are just multipliers based on activity. But based on a variety of factors, you can at least just estimate what somebody's maintenance calories would be based on, height, weight, gender, general activity, etc. So from there, you have a starting point of their total number of calories. Reactive modeling would be that person is tracking their calories, and then we're paying attention to what happens both on the scale and what's happening with their body composition. and then we adjust their diet up and down depending on what the goal is. That's essentially just diet coaching. And even if you have a predictive model, eventually you just get to that place anyway. It's just one allows you to maybe have a little bit more of an estimation, whereas the other one, you're just taking in information for a couple of weeks first and then starting to do the coaching. But essentially, after probably a few weeks, effectively, you're just coaching them through diet. With that being said, so if we take the case of, let's say, somebody who's looking to lose fat, I usually like using the example of just like a 200-pound male because it just makes the math really easy. What I would do with somebody is, let's say, I'll just make up a number. Let's say their maintenance calories is, 3,000 based on they train a couple days a week, they do some outdoor activities, what have you. The first priority for me from a diet perspective, assuming that they are generally somebody who eats really healthy and have had some experience when it comes to, as we talked about before, intentional eating. If there's somebody who has never tracked a food, never measured a food, never eaten a vegetable in their life, I'm actually probably going to start there and not really worry about the numbers quite so much at the beginning because there's just a foundational set of like habits that they need to create. Assuming that that's at least roughly in place, we can start to look at a little bit more like quantifiable metrics. So protein is almost always going to be our most important macronutrient from a body composition standpoint. So I usually recommend anywhere between like 0.8 grams per pound of body weight as high as about 1.5.
Can I ask you a follow-up question on that? Just because I've seen a lot of people, advocate for roughly a gram per pound. And I've seen some folks ask questions in comment sections where they're like, yeah, but what about the person who's morbidly obese? Like the person who's like 380 pounds currently, their diet consists of, it's 90% carbohydrate, or like 60% carb, 30 fat, 10 protein, in terms of percentages. Would you follow that recommendation for someone who is really overweight, obese, maybe morbidly obese? How do you work through that?
So great question. I was actually just going to answer that. So as a general rule of thumb, what I would do is the higher somebody's total level of body fat is, the lower my protein per body weight recommendation would be. So if you wanted to be really particular, you could base their protein intake based on lean muscle mass lean tissue or fat-free mass. The problem is, again, like not necessarily everybody has that number. Body fat levels can be kind of difficult to predict, especially as you start getting, honestly, like north of 20 or 25%. How accurately can you assess 30% and 40% body fat? It's very easy to see the difference between 5 and 10% body fat. As the body fat on the individual gets higher, it becomes a little bit more difficult to properly estimate that. But as you had mentioned, realistically, somebody who is a much larger individual like that probably needs less protein relative to their body weight because they don't actually have that much lean muscle. That I keep confusing these two terms. They don't have that much fat-free muscle mass. So I might aim closer to the 0.8. If they're morbidly obese, it might even be like 0.6. But that would be the exception, not the rule. So if we're talking about, again, in the case of males, like between, let's say like 6-7% body fat up to even like maybe like 25, that like 0.8 to 1.5 grams per pound body weight would be my recommendation. If you're a much leaner individual, if you are not only a lean individual, but someone who's quite muscular, somebody who trains quite extensively, my recommendation would be actually slightly higher because there's a greater demand for that protein turnover.
How about for women? Any changes there?
I'd keep it about the same. It doesn't seem from most of the research that I've seen that there's a massive difference in terms of male to female with how much protein that they should take in. Where the biggest difference tends to be in terms of macronutrients, male to female, is fat intake. So that kind of leads me to my next point is when we then want to look at how much dietary fat they're getting in, For men, usually I'm looking at like 0.2 to 0.3 grams per pound body weight. So if you're a 200-pound individual, maybe around 50 or 60 grams of fat would be about the baseline that I would want. You could go a little bit higher. The problem is that if you start to go lower, fat is required for certain vitamins and minerals to be absorbed properly in the body. We also require for, hormone production, testosterone in particular. We tend to see with women, because there's a little bit more volatility in terms of their hormonal profile, especially if they're menstruating, proportionally you might want a little bit more fat. So again, not going to be the case for everybody, but in general, you likely want a little bit higher dietary fat intake for women relative to their body weight. Rather than 0.3, it might be 0.35, something like that. Like it's not a lot, but you likely want to see slightly more fat intake for women, just as a means of maintaining proper hormonal profile. And then from there, the last thing we really need to worry about is carbohydrate. And carbs are probably going to be the thing that fluctuates the most within somebody's diet. And that's going to go up or down just depending on what their energy needs are. So if they are in a caloric deficit, and let's say, again, we've got this 200-pound individual, they're doing 200 grams of protein, let's say 60 grams of fat. So what's the math on that? 1340 calories. I hope I did that math fast. So let's say they want to be in a 500 calorie deficit. We're going to take, let's say, 2,500 calories minus 1340. So you're at 1160 divided by 4. So you're going to be roughly 250 grams, 260 grams of carbs, something like that.
Little do we know, Ryan has someone full-time working a calculator in the corner of his office just so that way he can do rapid math.
I just have a little gnome beside me and he's just doing this.
Little accountant friend. Very cool. And so once you establish that, from my understanding, the next step would be, okay, we have a starting point. It works for the client. Great. Which I think is an important thing to get confirmation from the client as well. And then from there, it's about establishing lead and lag metrics that you can monitor so that way you know if you're progressing or not. For those that don't know the difference between a lead and a lag metric, a lead metric would be usually you're tracking behavior, you're not tracking outcomes. So you might track, lead metrics for a week would be, did I exercise this week? The amount of target times that I wanted to, yes or no? Did I follow my meal plan on these days, yes or no? My hours of sleep on a daily basis, et cetera. Those would be all lead metrics. Lag metrics, especially the ones that would be relevant in the context of fat loss, would be, for instance, seeing the number change on the scale, seeing your body weight change. It could also be, using calipers and doing like caliper testing at very specific sites done consistently to see, well, okay, are these areas that I care about in terms of adiposity decreasing over time? And so establishing what are going to be some lead and lag metrics that are specific to your client's goals will give you the opportunity to know whether or not what you're doing is working. And then you're in this cycle of reactive modeling. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then it really, like you said, it's about diet coaching at that point. It's like, well, okay, is this working? Yes or no? And you go from there.
Yeah. One important thing I want to note, you had asked it and I forgot to get to it, is looking at rates of loss and rates of gain.
Right.
So again, I will say, assuming that this person is what I call like an intermediate dieter or above, like they've got those necessary habits already in place. Generally speaking, for a weight loss diet, I would want to aim for around 1% body weight loss per week. So that 200-pound person, roughly 2 pounds of total weight loss each week. Now, there's some things that are going to skew that. If you are a very, very overweight individual, that rate of loss could probably be higher, 1.5, maybe even like 2%. If you're doing a very drastic shortcut, like a mini cut, you could also probably afford to have a much higher rate of loss. The other thing as well to note is typically what you'll see is, the first week or so, people will have a substantial drop in weight. And then they will react almost too quickly and be like, oh, I got to bring my calories up because I lost so much weight week one. The reality is that first week or so, the first initial drop is going to be a combination of just, water weight, GI weight, like poop in your intestines and whatnot, just less total food, etc. So, and even sometimes what you'll see is as food comes down as well, you'll see like a drop in inflammation. So a lot of that initially, like you might see, I've probably seen as high as 7 or 8 pounds in the first week, and then it will start to level off. So kind of after week one is when I'll start to pay attention to what the rate of loss is. And then that's essentially guiding a lot of what the changes are going to be on paper. So do calories need to come up or down? Does activity need to come up or down? And then as you had said, there's going to be other things we pay attention to that are maybe a bit more subjective, just quality of sleep, mental state, etc. So
Love it. Thank you. Brett, do you have any follow-up questions or, how would I say, strategies coming from the specific demographic that you work with?
Pertaining to this specifically, I find it occasionally challenging with clients who haven't had that kind of experience because there's sometimes some information missing that they don't know that you need to know about certain things. Like if, maybe the quantity of sleep in there is there, but the quality isn't, and they're waking up frequently in the night, or like some other information, work stress, stuff like that, that might be affecting things. I've had clients in the past who have had, long periods of stagnation when they're in a weight loss phase. And I find that like diet coaching and reassurance and telling them, we talked about pre-framing beforehand, that knowing that these things might happen, but not making any drastic changes when they do. Let's just stay the course. There might be some stuff happening in your life. If at 4 to 6 weeks, we're still not noticing any changes, then we're going to start, affecting or changing the formula a little bit and seeing if we can lose things.
Yeah, I like
something
that.
Brett said there made me think of something that I think is really important as well. Because again, we're talking just kind of X's and O's here. But it's something that's always really important to consider is that this is a person that has many aspects of their life outside of just dieting. And I think that something that's really helpful is being able to identify like what's the rate limiter to their progress. Is the rate limiter that they're not getting enough protein? Or is the rate limiter that their work schedule is so hectic that they can't eat, 4 home cooked meals or whatever it happens to be? Is the rate limiter that they can't afford X, Y, and Z, whatever it happens to be? So they being able to identify like what's the thing that is holding back their progress the most, and then can we address that? If we can, amazing. If we can't, then okay, what's the next best thing that we can address? And then just starting to pick away at that list over time. And it's always going to be a living document, so to speak, because people have lives, right? But I think what Brett said there is really important. I think in particular, if you work in this industry and you're an experienced trainer and coach, because my assumption is your rate is probably high, and that tends to attract clients who probably have more money and very likely have maybe more demanding jobs, and then therefore they have more life stress outside of the gym. So those are going to be things that you need to accommodate for that client. And the conversations that you have with a 50-year-old, board member exec guy is different than the 21-year-old college student that you train. They have very different life stresses and therefore are going to require different solutions.
For sure.
Oh my God. All my doctors during COVID, because of the exceptional PPE that they had to wear, I'd see them for a session and it's like, oh, how'd your shift go yesterday? Pretty good. I worked 16 hours and didn't take a sip of water. And it's like, what? Just because they'd have to get their mask refitted every time. So they'd be working whole days without a sip. And it's like, oh my God, what are we doing here? Anyways, I'm glad that's over. My doctors can drink again.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, water and other liquids.
Mm-hmm.
One thing just kind of tying into what you had mentioned, Rye, in terms of rate of loss, and Brett, when you were talking about bringing back this idea of the importance of pre-framing. I remember this was 2 or 3 years ago, maybe, yeah, definitely 3 years ago at least. This gentleman that I was working with, and one of his primary objectives was fat loss. And so I made some initial dietary recommendations, one of which was to increase his protein as a means of helping with his body composition goals, helping him feel a little bit more satiated after his meals and those types of things. And his grams of protein that he was eating each day, what like in terms of total grams, it wasn't that low, but it was definitely on the low end. And he was a big boy. And so coming back to what you were talking about, it's like, I'm not going to give this guy 300 grams of protein to eat per day. Maybe let's say the target for him was around 200, 220, 230. And he was like on average each day eating, I don't know, 120. So I was like, well, let's jack it up. Maybe let's bring it up to like a target of 160 or something like that. And we'll go from there. And what was really interesting, because you had mentioned, Rye, that initially rate of loss commonly will be a little bit steeper at the beginning. If it's going to be steep, it's usually closer to the beginning than like towards the middle or the end. Him, it was the opposite, in the sense that at the beginning, his body really didn't respond well to having more protein in his diet. And so although his measurements were going down, you could see him losing weight on his face. The inches were going down on his abdomen, arms, chest, etc. His weight on the scale was essentially the same or going down like a quarter of a pound a week because of gastric weight. Like his body wasn't able to like evacuate and like digest and manage the protein. And he was really freaking out. He was like, what the hell? This isn't working. And I'm like, it is working, man. Like if you look at your inches, like things are working, but there's one of these metrics that's kind of making it seem like you're not progressing. So, stick the course or stay the course, excuse me. And then he also consulted with, I believe it was a naturopathic doctor, as a means of just bolstering his gut a little bit to help his body evacuate. We brought in some magnesium, is it calcinate? A type of magnesium that helps with gut motility. And immediately just, he started feeling he was able to evacuate better, but then also B, by bolstering his digestion, we mitigated against this happening again. And he responded really well. And so it's one of those things that I think it's also, we were talking about lead and lag metrics earlier it's kind of during this conversation where it's non-linear, right? Everything's kind of related to each other. But for me, that really solidified the importance of not just having one piece of data that you use, but rather having a few, because one thing in and of itself can sometimes lead to confusion. You can get like a false read on the situation if you're just looking at one, but if you have a few different things, it can give you a better idea or a better grasp on what's actually happening for someone.
Two things you said there.
Sorry.
Oh. We're in rock, paper, scissors. I'll say this really quick. Two things you said, ET, that I think are really important and smart that you did with this individual. The first thing was, even if your target was 200 grams of protein, if this guy's eating 100 or 120, because actually incrementally bringing them up there. The human body does not do well with really drastic changes. So slowly easing his body into being able to handle, an increase in protein and maybe whatever else he's eating, I think is really intelligent. And then the other thing, we've had a variety of people on this podcast talk about digestion. And I think it's just something that's worth double clicking on. Ultimately, the food that you can assimilate, that's what actually matters. If you're eating a whole bunch of food that your body can't handle, besides the fact that you're probably adding a higher degree of digestive distress, which is then going to just compound these issues, even if you're taking in, 200 grams of protein, but if your body can't handle it, you're not actually absorbing the nutrients from that food very well. So through whatever strategy you choose to use, finding a way to allow your body to better digest the food that you're eating is a really, really important piece to this whole nutrition conversation. Sorry, Brett, go ahead.
That's okay. You gave me some more ammunition, actually. You were mentioning the ramping up over time. And like, as important as it is for the body to make those adjustments slowly, our mind probably takes even more time to adjust to that stuff. So one of my big notes was introducing small changes over time, because nobody. I've rarely seen like a 180 degree turnaround last. It'll usually go for a little bit and then kind of peter out. I had a friend who didn't have the best diet, and I remember this like wonderful moment on Instagram. He had gone to like Pure Kitchen in Ottawa, which is this like super vegan granola restaurant, and he had gotten like the healthiest thing on the menu. It was probably some like fermented mushroom kale like bowl and a bottle of kombucha. And he's like, I'm turning things around, everybody. Got a bunch of likes on it. And not even an hour later was a picture of a bag of McDonald's and was like, I couldn't even get through 2 bites.
Well, I mean, when it comes to Pure Kitchen, the problem is that he didn't get the, was it spicy Korean cauliflower wings?
Mm-hmm.
Delicious. That was the
Very
problem.
good.
Yeah.
I mean, that'll
I'm
clear
a
your
bit of
digestion
a,
out like that.
I'm a bit of a Caesar salad expert myself too, and their Caesar salad is pretty baller too.
Noted.
Anyways, I wanted to ask you guys, are there any situations that you've used like meal timing or nutrient timing in for clients, either physically or to get over like some mental barriers around their diet?
I have for sure, but Rye, how about you?
Yeah, for sure. I would say meal timing is lower on the list of priorities. Like this is something we talk about in the course quite a bit. Meal timing is not irrelevant. It's just not more important than total calories, macros, etc. I would say the case in which meal timing is the most important is the higher level of, I'm going to just say athlete. Some people call people like clients lifestyle athletes as well, but we'll say just the higher of caliber of competition or whatever the goals are for that individual. If you have somebody, as ET said, who's 300 pounds and they're a desk jockey and they just want to feel better, meal timing probably doesn't matter quite as much. You have a high level athlete, bodybuilder, runner, football player, whatever it happens to be, that meal timing does start to become important, and in particular, where those macros fit throughout those meals as well. So, for example, for a lot of people, it's probably better off, let's say you train midday, you're probably better off spacing, your fats, your higher fat meals as far away from your training as possible, and having like your higher carbohydrate meals closer to training to facilitate not only higher training performance, but then also the reuptake of glycogen post training as well. And we know that fats are going to slow digestion down to a certain degree, which isn't a bad thing. I still think having some fats in every meal is not a bad idea. You just maybe don't want to have your like highest fat meal pre and post training. It's probably going to sit in your gut while you're training, which is not going to be very comfortable. And then you're probably going to delay the uptake of nutrients post training if you have a really, really high fat meal. Again, this is one of those, like, it's a little bit of majoring in the minors. It's not the most important thing in the world, but it is something to consider. Excuse me. I also like, if you're staying away from, the effect that nutrition has strictly on, let's just say, like performance athletes, I also think that adjusting meal timing and even like meal frequency to just, we talked about reducing obstacles. So it's like, is it more feasible for somebody to get 3 meals in a day instead of 5? Like 5 just might not be realistic. If they can fit 3 meals a day in, amazing. That's better. If they like having a bunch of like fatty food before bed, cool. Just shift fats away from their other 2 meals or 3 meals. So there's ways of strategizing that just from an adherence standpoint as well. If we just ignore the effect on performance, as you said, kind of, Brett, just having ways of strategizing this just to make it fit better for the individual, I think can be a really useful strategy as well.
Yeah, I love that. I think I don't have much to add, but I think you really nailed it on the head of like, when does meal timing matter? And it matters more and more and more the degree to which someone has athletic goals or they have athletic pursuits. And, myself, with the populations that I work with in a rehab context, meal timing, nope, zero, not a consideration. For my endurance athletes, a ton. Making sure that they, like, around training, if you're going to go out for like an interval session in the afternoon or in the evening, making sure that you are fed adequately and that you have with food that is digested well, like you mentioned, Rye, like things that usually aren't too high in protein or in fat in like the hour or so, sometimes even 75, 90 minutes before. So making sure that they're well fed for, either like really high intensity work or even like more sustained longer bouts. And also like here, like we could start talking a little bit about like even like intra-workout nutrition, especially within the context of, it's more common in the endurance world. But I asked you a question a few years ago, I think, Rye, that I actually, maybe we could table real quick before we wrap up. I'll give you a rapid fire question towards the end. Hopefully I don't
I'm
forget
very
it.
bad at rapid fire answers, so
I know, but we'll impose a control because I'll just turn off the recording. So, but I do have a question that I'd like to revisit because it was interesting that it's present in the endurance world and not so much in the bodybuilding world or as prevalent. So we'll come back to that. But yeah, I think that like, especially when it comes to athletic populations, timing matters. And even if we think of like folks who are peaking for a race, like any kind of endurance event, one of the primary conversations that you're having with these folks in the weeks leading up to it is like, what's your race week nutrition? Not just race day. What's your race week? And so there is an element of timing, not just on a daily basis, but like from a slightly more macro perspective of, carbohydrate loading during a week leading up to an event to make sure that, muscle and liver glycogen stores are topped up and are, in a good spot. So there's a lot that could be said there. So yeah, I don't think I have much to add other than to just kind of double click on what you said, Ryan.
If I
yeah,
can make
something I wanted.
one more comment regarding you guys had said that don't see as much importance for lifestyle clients or not like peak athletes. The one really big use case I've seen is just managing satiety, just like how
sure.
full you're feeling. It's one of those words that you see written all the time, but I never say it.
I never know how to say it also. Yeah.
But like I've had some really good luck with clients getting protein and fats in early, and it starts their day off with a full belly that they are usually a bit better, make some better choices for their lunches and their meals after that. I've also experimented a little bit with some clients with some intermittent fasting. I'm not sure how much I buy into all of the like claims about insulin sensitivity and like the kind of like other body benefits that they claim, but I think that it can be good if you're the kind of person who can wait until lunchtime and eat a modest meal. It can be effective for some people. Some people, they get to like that 12 p.m. and are like, oh, I need 3 double cheeseburgers now, and like intermittent fasting is not for that person. But if you are the kind of person that can wait and you are looking to lose some weight, I think it can be an effective strategy for controlling calories. That is kind of like the use case that I've used some nutrient and meal timing for average folk.
I totally agree.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And actually, something that I think is also relevant for, I suppose, is relevant for athletes as well. But let's say that the lifestyle client, it's unrealistic to expect that people won't ever have cheat meals or free meals, like that kind of thing. But I think where people can run into trouble is depending on the size of the meal, the type of meal, how their body handles it. You're talking about whether intermittent fasting has an effect on insulin sensitivity. And I would agree. I think that the time period is so short that I'm unsure quite how profound that effect is. Because the thing that we really see is these changes that happen have everything to do with consistency over time. So, if intermittent fasting is a strategy that allows you to eat less over time and you lose body fat, then you are going to be more insulin sensitive. And I do think I actually like fasting or even like having lower food days for individuals with very high food demands.
Yeah.
For the reason that it actually gives the stomach a bit of a break. So to that point, when we're talking about cheat meals, for example, and again, I think this applies more for individuals with very large food demands. So think large bodybuilders, powerlifters, high-level endurance athletes that have to eat a ton to fuel performance. Let's say you have, a extra large meat lovers pizza and some cheese sticks at night. Delicious. I love it.
I love how that's where you go extra large and extra large pizza with cheese sticks.
I'm speaking from the heart here. This is
that's your meal.
Really, really sits true to me. The problem is, I'll use myself as an example. I'm not 23 anymore. I'm 33. And there might have been a time where I could eat that, tolerate it, and be fine the next day. So as much as pizza is my favorite food in the world, as I'm sure it is probably many other people, ET included. Let's say, like, what's your carbohydrate demand, ET, when you're running, like training for a marathon? Just
Oh,
ballpark.
I don't know, 500, 600 grams a day.
Okay, so 600 grams of just carbohydrates. You eat a massive pizza at 8, 9 p.m. That sits heavy in your stomach, slows your digestion down. You wake up in the morning and you're like still kind of burping whatever the meat lovers pizza was from the night before. That starts to delay your ability to tolerate food and really feel hungry until later in the day. And now you're in this situation where between noon and when you go to bed, you've got to try to cram 500 or 600 grams of carbs in.
Mm-hmm.
And you end up kind of in this vicious cycle of just really, really putting a lot of stress on the digestive system. It's not to say you can't have those meals, but I think they just need to be a little bit more strategic and just more mindful. So, something that I have done more lately and I'll do with, it's basically clients that are out of their 20s. I hate being that old guy now, but like there is something to be said for when you're 21 and 22 and you can eat anything, you feel fine.
Yeah.
But for anybody else, I think figuring out meals that give you that dopamine hit that you can socialize around, whatever, and they don't impact the following days, like digestion and your ability to tolerate food is really important. Like I would eat pizza every day if it didn't bother my stomach. It's just like not a food that I can handle when I then have to eat so much the following day.
For
So I think
sure.
that's just something to keep in mind as well.
I've also used fasting for myself and clients as well as a means of experiencing hunger and developing a better relationship with hunger signaling. I find like a lot of people get victimized by hunger signaling, and then they just eat compulsively. But if there's a constraint of I don't eat between these times, you then are forced to face and feel those hunger signals and then manage them. And honestly, I think that that's really healthy. It can really empower and equip people to not be victimized by hunger, but rather to be able to make decisions that are consistent with what they actually need if they zoom out, in contrast to just a compulsion in a moment.
That's what Ozempic did for one of my old clients. She was only on it for about a month, maybe 6 weeks, but it allowed her to be hungry and realize that nothing bad is going to happen. Like her body isn't going to shut down. She's not
Yeah.
going to get excessive fatigue. She's just a little bit hungry. And in a couple hours, when she's near her healthy foods, she can then eat that food, but like doesn't have to have that snack as soon as the hunger pangs hit.
100%. 100%. So we're starting to get close to the end of our time today. So I think what I'd like to do is I'd like to do a little bit of a summary. I'm curious what stands out for you guys when it comes to like your top 3 to 5 considerations, your bullet points when it comes to key considerations for structuring diet plans. What comes to mind? And then after that, I've got that bonus question that will have to be rapid fire, a concise answer, Rye. So we're going to be putting you on the spot after, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So first and foremost, Brett, we'll go with you. What are some of the key considerations that you have in mind if you had to create some bullet points when it comes to how to create a diet plan or considerations for a diet plan? What would you say?
So we need some data before we start. So we want to talk to the client, ask some good questions, dive deep, try to get as much quality information as we can out of them. Depending on the client, there might be some more assessment required, like a food journal or, weeks of weigh-ins, but we can start to establish a bit of a plan for them moving forward. And depending on that client, there's a number of strategies we can use to get them where they need to go. I think that about sums it up before getting too far into the weeds.
I like it. Great. Rye, how about you?
Yeah, I think my answer is going to be pretty similar. I think everything starts with the needs analysis. In particular, again, something that I always think is really helpful is just, can we identify what the rate limiters, what the roadblocks are going to be? Problems are inevitable. It's just being prepared for them so that we can actually solve them ahead of time. I think something that's really helpful, we haven't actually really talked about this much. I had it in my notes. I think we talked about before we recorded, differentiating between, it might have been Brett said, like weight loss, weight gain, health.
Yeah.
And to a certain degree, those are separate, but I think that the overlap on that Venn diagram is quite large. Something we talk about a lot, if performance, however broad you want to define performance, but if performance is your goal, there is a prerequisite level of health required to do that. Mm. If you're an extreme athlete, of course, there are certain risks and behaviors that are not 100% healthy. But actually, I think Paul O'Neill posted something about this a week or two ago that I really liked. And he had talked about the healthier your baseline is, when it comes time to accept the risk for whatever your sport is, your body is better able to tolerate. You've got a much larger buffer. If you're in poor health and then you have to, really, put the pedal to the floor kind of thing, pedal to the metal, your ability to buffer that stress and that just like risk on the body just isn't very great. And you can redline it really quick. So I actually think having just baseline recommendations of, getting a certain amount of water in every day, prioritizing sleep. Like we haven't really talked about this much, but getting like a certain amount of fiber in. Mm-hmm. Like fiber is going to have a tremendous effect on someone's gut health, heart health as well. Mm-hmm. So I think actually implementing that alongside, how much protein, carbs, fats you get, like those are very important. And in a way, they sort of solve each other. But I had written down here something simple, have like a strategy for every meal. It's like, I'm going to have, some kind of lean source of protein, however much you're going to have something colorful, fruits, veggies, whatever it happens to be, something that's fibrous, is like rich in nutrients, have X amount of water, and then fill in the rest with like carbohydrates of choice. It's a very simple framework, but I think if you can have something like that, you're at least prioritizing health in some way, and that's going to yield, I think, a better result in the long run. Sorry, that was not a short answer.
Short-ish by Ryan's standards. I appreciate that. Thanks, man. The bullets that I have written down here are: number one, needs analysis. I think we're all in agreement. Second is reminding ourselves to take a human first approach, that our clients are not just clients who choose to pay us money. There are people with lives, other other challenges, other priorities, other values that sometimes enter into conflict. And so holding space for that, because that also happens to us. And so I think that it's important to be empathetic towards some of the challenges that they will contend with. Third would be to establish lead and lag metrics, so that way you have an idea of like, is this working? So you have some data that you can use as a means of informing some of your subsequent steps. And then the fourth piece, it's ambiguous, but it's to work with the client as a means of nudging them in the direction that they want to go. Like we talked about earlier, I think, Brett, you said this, that generally speaking, enormous overnight change tends to be unsustainable for a lot of people. Some people thrive with that, but I think if we zoom out, most people thrive with incremental, small to moderate, in contrast to like radical changes. And so working with the client, so there's an element of collaboration there as a means of nudging them, in contrast to like shoving them towards their goal. And then rinse and repeat. You essentially just go from point 3 of having your metrics, working with the client. You do that until they accomplish what they want. Before we wrap up here, I have my follow-up question, which I wrote down because I have goldfish syndrome. And it has to do with, in the endurance world, and Rye, you literally have 3 minutes to answer this. So when you're done, I'm going to like put an X on the screen. When it comes to the endurance world, it is really common for people to use intra-workout carbohydrate as a potentiator of performance. And there's also some interesting literature that has shown that even calorie-free solutions that taste sweet potentiate performance. And the theory behind this is that the brain is always managing resources. And so as we're exerting ourselves, if there's this perception that fuel is coming in, that it seems like it actually increases the degree to which people can work hard, even if there's actually no fuel coming in. And so my observation is that this doesn't seem to happen as much in the bodybuilding world as it does in the endurance world. And yet in the bodybuilding world, your ability to drive a stimulus is such an important part of the equation. Why do you think that this is less prominent in the bodybuilding world in contrast to the endurance world? 3 minutes. Time starts now.
So I would actually say, you know, Tim Walsh's mentor, John Meadows, is probably one of the guys who popularized intra-workout nutrition
Okay.
almost more than anybody else. So he's somebody who recognized the benefit of intra-workout nutrition. I think there's some question whether or not it directly improves performance within a session, just because the reality is you're not going through fuel the same degree that an endurance athlete is, and the time frame isn't quite as long. I do think that pre-workout nutrition probably has a greater effect on potentiating performance. I think you could make a case that having carbohydrate during your session maybe starts the process of repair post training. I think that might be one of the arguments that John Meadows has used. My thought, and this is completely conjecture, like I haven't read anything about this, especially when you talk about having something sweet still potentiating performance. I wonder if there is an effect on dopamine and that potentiating a higher degree of maybe focus and then ultimately, therefore, an improvement in performance. I don't know that, but that's a presupposition that I would make. But to your point, I think that intra-workout nutrition is less powerful for the training session itself within bodybuilding as it would be in endurance sport, just because the caloric consumption during training is not quite as high. But I still think that there is a benefit, if nothing else, because it's a very easy way to get carbohydrates in very quickly. So over the span of an entire day, if you can add an extra 30 to 50 grams of carbohydrates during your workout that you just drink, that's, again, especially for large individuals, that's just food that you don't have to chew and eat, that your body has to digest. So that, I think, is actually one of the big benefits.
Sweet. That was a fantastic, concise answer. Bao. Fantastic. That was really great. Go
Something I
ahead, Brett.
noticed with how we were talking today is that almost all of our language, none of it was really restrictive. Even when we're talking about restricting calories, we're talking about like, okay, you should be eating this, you should try to eat this, you should try to do this throughout your day. So even though we're talking about restriction, the language isn't restrictive, which I think is really important for clients. Like as soon as you say don't do this, it becomes taboo, and it's like almost something they want to do. So if we can make the language a little bit more positive and additive rather than restrictive, I think that leads to more success with clients too.
I love that. I think that's a really great place to wrap up. Gentlemen, thank you so much for today. For the listeners, if you enjoyed and learned, that's a nice sensei bow. Nice. If you learned anything from today, if you enjoyed today's episode, please like and share, with your peers, with your friends, family, your dog. All of it is appreciated. As always, gentlemen, thank you so much for today. And to our listeners, thank you for your time and your attention. And we will talk to you once again on our next podcast episode. Bye for now.
Cheers.
See ya.